This is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., and I have the pleasure of conversation today with Elizabeth Bruenig, formerly of the Washington Post here in town, now with the New York Times, and she is among the more thoughtful young Christian commentators available in America today, and I enjoy noting that she is Methodist by background, as I am, and a convert of recent years to the Roman Catholic Church, which was a great loss to Methodism, but a gain for Catholicism. So Liz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
There was a tweet you had some days ago in response to our current moment of angst in America, essentially saying, and I may not be quoting it with the exactitude, that there are calls for a sort of national repentance, but seemingly no clear path for forgiveness or atonement. If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, so I mean, the goal of, I think, forgiveness is to give someone the opportunity to have an identity that's not based on the way in which they failed, the failure, the offense, whatever it was. And the goal of calling for repentance is less clear. There are a lot of reasons you could call for repentance that don't have anything to do with forgiveness. There were centuries and centuries, millennia of human history in which the Christian notion of forgiveness, the notion of forgiveness that obtains now, was not part of anybody's culture. I mean, the sort of unconditional, starting afresh, forgiving, forgetting tendencies, especially based on little, sort of wasn't the dominant understanding of how that practice ought to work. So I'm not saying that the only reason someone could call for repentance or atonement is, in order to forgive, but it does seem to be the only good reason to me to call for repentance is with the hope of forgiveness, reconciling. And that doesn't seem to be a popular notion right now. I got several emails about that tweet that were very upset. And people were essentially saying, I don't have any problem with forgiveness. I just have a problem with the victim having the burden of forgiving someone. Well, that's just forgiveness. I mean, that's what it is. It's tough. It's a sacrifice. But I think it's also maybe the only way that civil society really hangs together. If you continually deny people the opportunity to have an identity apart from their punished, their scorned identity, then you're inviting them to sort of permanently inhabit that failure in other words, not to change. And even if they do change because they are good-hearted and they take comfort in their failure, they're not going to be able to reconcile with anyone as long as they're prevented from having an identity that is unattached to their failure. So, I mean, I think it's a very disturbing thing in American life how many people seem quite offended by the idea of forgiveness itself and seem to find it immoral. I think that's very disturbing.
That would seem, to my mind, to be a weakness of our current moment compared to, say, the protest of 50, 55, 60 years ago, especially the civil rights movement emerging as it did out of the Black church with a strong notion of challenge, but also of atonement and forgiveness. And we don't seem to have those same spiritual tools available in our present culture, and at least not as a matter of national consensus. Would you agree?
Well, sure. And, it's certainly the case that forgiveness in any kind of Christian sense or any kind of Christian sense of justice, peace, or mercy, these were not dominant habits in the Jim Crow South and the antebellum South, Reconstruction era and well up into the civil rights movement. I mean, it's one thing to say that only victims can forgive, and I think that's true. Even if you sort of cast a wide net in terms of who's affected by something, but It's also the case that it's hard to stake out a place for forgiveness in a country that's not particularly virtuous whatsoever. So forgiveness is an extremely important virtue. It's not the only one, and it's certainly difficult to have it stand alone as the only public virtue when mercy or justice, these are not virtues that people adhere to. And so that, I believe, is probably the experience of most Black Americans then and now, is that, you know, the landscape, the moral landscape of the United States has been extraordinarily lacking. And so for forgiveness to be this sort of dim or absent virtue now, it seems like meditating on a really odd thing. And when I think about our issues with forgiveness, I'm really primarily thinking about the sort of cancel culture stuff. The protest movement now is more about laws, and people following the laws, and the people who are charged with enforcing the laws following the law, which it seems like, a different set of concerns, concern over justice, rather than atonement. But that's a piece of it.
Some people, and I believe Ross Douthat would be among them, have described our current period of protest as a fourth or fifth great awakening in America, but one that is not specifically religious. Would you understand it in those terms?
Sure. I mean, it's perfectly possible, I think, to have like a moral awakening that's unmoored to any particular religion. I think that's, yeah, and I think that's a perfectly good way of describing it. And I don't think it has to be pejorative, right, to describe it that way. I think it would be quite a good thing to have a moral awakening.
Getting personal, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing your own spiritual and intellectual journey. I believe, as I mentioned, you were raised Methodist in Texas, and later, in recent years, you became Catholic. How did that come about exactly?
Well, I was born in Arlington, Texas, which is between Dallas and Fort Worth. And I was raised in a Methodist household. Both my parents were Methodist. I think their families were completely Methodist. Although there were some more interesting Protestant charismatic tendencies on my grandfather's side, real snake handlers and so forth in Northern Georgia. I liked my church. I went to Vacation Bible School, and I was a Vacation Bible School teacher, chaperone when I got older, and had a great time with it. I mean, I taught Sunday school in the Methodist church to little children, and it was fun. And I didn't really go through any significant period of like rejecting the faith I'd been brought up with. I felt like it was, sort of a gift that I had been given, that I never significantly doubted the existence of God. And so I was pretty comfortable in tradition. But when I went to college in Boston. I went to Brandeis. And Brandeis is this great historically Jewish college. And what happened at Brandeis was that I took a class from a rabbi who was a really gifted teacher. And in his course, we were reading Matthew, we read Genesis and Exodus, and very, very closely, almost as sort of progenitors of the Western canon, in a sense. And I started to realize, as we did the sort of supplemental readings around these texts, that Judaism has a literary accompaniment tradition. You're not reading the Torah all on your own. You're actually reading it with, thousands of people who have read it and written about it over the years. And so I was like, well, it would make sense for Christianity to have something similar, right? Because when you think about it, it is sort of absurd to imagine that, an ordinary, everyday individual could approach something reporting the relationship between God and this particular nation of people, and then the Gospels, and understand them instantly, right? I mean, if human beings can use metaphor, certainly God can to even greater effect. And in fact, we can tell from the Gospels that parable seems to be a sort of favored way for God to explain things to human beings. So I thought to myself, we have to have a literary accompaniment tradition. So this was the sort of first nail in the coffin, this objection to a sola scriptura. And I started reading Augustine. And I ended up going to graduate school and studying Augustine at Cambridge. I got my master's in Christian theology over there. And it was there that I converted. And, there were reasons, I think, at times, and especially at that time, I thought that the reasons were much more important than I think they were now. I think it was much more emotional, much more of a feeling, called, and, falling in love. And so I converted at Cambridge, I think it was 23, and now here I am today, and I've not regretted it. I mean, Catholic Church is far from a perfect institution, as I think is widely known. And I reported on that. I'll have more reporting on that soon. But theologically, I remain very close to tenets of Catholicism. But I especially remain close to Catholic.
You mentioned Augustine. What other writers, thinkers, commentators, past or present, have been especially influential and encouraging for you?
Yeah, it's difficult to even think of them all. I love Augustine. I love Bede, the Venerable Bede, his ecclesial history of the English people. I thought was very moving. Recently did a podcast episode where I covered a lot of his writing on the first plague pandemic. And I really enjoyed the letters of Abelard and Eloise. I thought those were beautiful sort of classic texts, whether or not you're a religious person, but if you are a Christian, they're meaningful in all of them. I benefited quite a bit from reading about the Middle Ages and religious practice in the Middle Ages, which I think has been very, very helpful to me in terms of understanding how those people view the Gospels and the relationship to Christ. That's been very, very interesting to me. And then in modern times, you sort of have your pick, right? I mean, in terms of influences, James Cone, Cornel West, read a lot of Luke Bretherton's stuff. He's at Duke right now. I think he's really fantastic in terms of political theology. I went to Cambridge, so I was around the whole radical orthodoxy thing. And that's like John Milbank, Catherine Pickstock, and so on and so forth. And my tutor was John Hughes, who wrote about Christianity and Marxism. And he was extraordinarily influential.
And there would be a caricature or a stereotype by many American Christians that the field in which you find yourself, journalism, is, if not hostile to religion, at least indifferent. Is that caricature entirely unfair?
I mean, it's pretty unfair in that, insofar as religion is an area of interest, of course the media wants to cover it. So, at the Washington Post, there were very successful efforts, very successful efforts to cover religion in a sort of sustained, deep, and thoughtful way. I'm so sorry. And all the more so at the Times, I think there is a great attention given to covering religion. Now, I think a lot of Americans, especially on the conservative side, which my whole family is, being in Texas, would maybe suspect that journalists themselves are dismissive of or condescending towards people who are religious. And I can't speak for everybody involved in the industry. But, in the desks that I've been at, I was at Outlook at the Washington Post, which is in the newsroom, and then I was in op-eds at WAPO, and now I'm in op-eds at the Times. There have been lots of religious people. The media sort of considers itself to be and to have this sort of dispensation to focus on objectivity and things that can be generally proven, and to kind of speak in public reasons. And so I think there are reasons that a lot of journalists aren't open about their religious convictions. They feel like it may compromise their credibility. So, I mean, yes and no. I can see why people feel that way. And I would just, promise them that there's more going on behind the scenes.
And then finally, ending hopefully on an upbeat note, coming out of this time of national angst, period of protest, period of pandemic, do you see any signs of a spiritual renewal in the church in America and in American culture in general? Are we in a spiral, or are we getting ready for a rejuvenation?
I hope we're getting ready for a rejuvenation. I think we're gonna, things are gonna be hard for a while, it appears, especially, financially for millions and millions of people. And so even once we have sort of stabilized infection rates, there's still gonna be the economic impact, which is difficult to blow off, right? And, nevertheless, I think you've seen a lot of spiritual institutions rise to the occasion. So there have been many churches. I reported on one in a piece about Texas reopening. Churches have sort of led the way down there on financing and operating shelters for people, as people, especially in the service industry, lose their jobs and become homeless. And as evictions begin to soar, that kind of service is going to be even more necessary. And I pray that the religious community in the United States does what it's called to do by every major faith and cares for the poor. And then, in terms of how it's going to hit people in relation to faith, the plagues, you never know. People sometimes kind of lose their faith in God. If they had it, that was certainly a feature of the Black Death, right? In the medieval eras, you got a kind of nihilism almost out of it. But there were also people who became even more convicted in the Black Death. The flagellants, maybe the most exciting example. And in between those two poles, there have to be, countless modes of experience. So I hope that the opportunity to serve and the togetherness of these kinds of catastrophes can engender does lead to a spiritual awakening. I pray that would be the outcome. I think we have a chance.
Elizabeth Bruenig, commentator with the New York Times, thank you for a very insightful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.